Welcome back to the Go Draft, taking your screenwriting to the next level. My name's Andy Gerdot. Sorry I've been away for a while. Had some family things that needed to be dealt with, and I'm back. And we are going to discuss today the distinction between writing for films, that is, say, movies, theatrical features, versus television. Both are forms of recorded dramatic fiction. So they're fundamentally the same. And as I said much earlier in the series, you, most of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about screenwriting also applies to television. It's filmic, dramatic storytelling. So, but there are distinctions, and you should be aware of them because they do affect the way you write and certainly affect the way you approach your career. Whether or not your material is going to be on a big screen in a theater, or whether it's going to be on a commercial network, or whether it's going to be streaming, or whether it's going to be on YouTube. It does affect things. When I started out 1,000 years ago writing, it was very different. Television and movies were very different. Television always had commercials. There were only 3 networks and then later 4 when Fox was created in the late 80s. But everything had commercials. This is before even HBO. TV comedies all had laugh tracks, or what in the business is called sweetening, which rarely happens anymore, but I'm sure it does on some comedies, but it's not much anymore. And most importantly of all, television always dealt with safe topics. And the reason was because there were only 3 networks, and so, or later 4. And so in order to make the most money, those networks wanted to get the hugest audience possible. They wanted to beat their competitors. So when there were 3 networks, they wanted to get more than a third of the audience. And in order to do that, they had to appeal to the widest possible audience, and in order to do that, at least they felt, in order to do that, they didn't want to offend anybody, any ethnic group, any age range. They wanted all their programming to appeal to everybody. And so as a result, the material, the topics that were dealt with in television for decades tended to be very safe. Some of it was very good, but it was tended not to be very chancy, let's put it that way. So because of this, feature writers and feature directors, screenwriters, screen directors, never did television, never, unless they were desperate for work. And even actors, movie stars, never did television. Some lesser movie stars would do it. But it was a major career decision, and usually a bad one, a backwards move if you had to do television, because the quality of the work was just nowhere near as good as it was in features. This is especially true in the 60s and 70s, when the second golden age of film took place, and writing for features, for film, for the movies was a big step up from writing television. So they never did television. Of course, they do now, very much so. Almost every major screenwriter and major director has done some television. But now, most of the best filmic storytelling is in television, not in film. Studio features, mainstream features, are now relegated to huge tentpole movies, which must earn back their huge budgets, just like those old TV networks with their thought process. We have to earn back this huge 100 million plus budget, so we have to appeal to everybody. We also have to appeal to foreign audiences more than domestic audiences. Used to be the other way around. The domestic audience was the bulk of the income, and the foreign audiences were an afterthought. Now it's exactly reversed. They want to get the money back from the foreign audiences, and the domestic audience adds to that, but it isn't their primary goal. And so as a result, most of the topics that they're going to even consider making a film about are based on an existing IP, an intellectual property, which is just a pretentious way of saying it's a comic book, it's an old movie, it's an old TV show. It's something that already has a built-in audience. So Mission Impossible, James Bond, Harry Potter, all the Marvel movies, Superman, Batman, everything is based on something else. To get an original movie set up at a mainstream major Hollywood studio is virtually impossible anymore. For all practical purposes, it is impossible. They don't, studios do not tell stories anymore. They just exploit brands. They're just looking for a brand they can exploit, whether that's James Bond or whether that's, Spider-Man or whether that's Paw Patrol. Just give me a brand that I can exploit so that I can try to get people into the theaters using that technique. In other words, mainstream movies now are safe the way television used to be. Of course, the other kind of film, feature film, is an independent feature, which is made outside, way outside usually, of the studio system. And of course, they can be incredibly creative and really good. But each one of them has to be built from scratch each time out. Say somebody has to write a spec screenplay. You got to find a director, unless the writer is the director. You've got to find a producer. You've got to find money. You've got to find a distributor, put it on the festival circuit, try to get a distributor that way or some other way. You've got to reinvent the wheel each time out. Because of that, while some indie films are very good, most of them aren't, because there's no system in place in order to ensure consistent quality. It's kind of similar to self-publishing books, which is a lovely thing that it's publishing a book is now so democratized that almost anybody can do it with very little money. The problem is everybody can do it, and therefore there's a trillion books out there, and the rest of us have no idea which ones might be good. The vast majority are terrible because there's no quality control. Those publishers and editors, as annoying as they could be, at least serve the purpose of vetting all the manuscripts that came through so that the really bad ones never got published or even close to it. Now anything can get published, and it's very similar that way to independent films. Almost anybody with a little bit of money can make a film, but that doesn't mean it's going to be any good, and we have to find ways to find the good material. So television, as a result of these phenomena, television is now where we tend to find more esoteric, more personal, more intelligent, and more chancy storytelling. Aesthetically, television is what movies used to be. Okay, so what are some of the distinctions between movies and television in terms of the experience of watching the entertainment? Well, movies are, first of course, presented on a large screen, much larger than your television screen. Even if you have a big screen TV, it's not going to be as large as a typical movie theater screen. And because of that, the material that you write for movies is going to tend to be larger than life, as opposed to, say, life-sized, which is what television material tends to be more like. What else? Movies have a captive audience. When you go to see a movie, you are a captive audience. Very few people are going to spend the money to go see a movie, drive half an hour to get there, half an hour to get home, and then walk out after 2 minutes or 5 minutes. You've got them at least for 10 or 15 minutes most of the time. I'll give you an example. In 1967, my friends and I were James Bond crazy, and we heard that there was a new James Bond movie called Casino Royale coming out. Now, we didn't know, because we weren't too savvy to Hollywood gossip, but we didn't know that this was not made by the producers who were making the other James This particular James Bond story not the one with Daniel Craig, this was in 1967, was being made by a producer who just did goofy comedies. So he decided to make Casino Royale into a goofy comedy, and it was very silly. And we sat down in the theater, lights go dark. We think we're about to see a really cool James Bond movie. And this is what we saw at the beginning that held our attention for the rest of the movie. This is what it was.
Mr. Bond?
Yes?
I'm Lieutenant Mathis of the Special Police. These are my credentials.
They appear to be in order.
Come with me.
Well, we thought that opening credits sequence was so cool. We sat there for 2 hours waiting for the movie to get good, and it never did. There was some funny stuff at the end with Woody Allen, where he clearly wrote his own material, but the rest of it was horrible. But because of that opening, we gave it 2 hours to try to get good. That's pushing it a bit much, but you do get a little bit of grace, period, when you're writing a feature. What else is different between the movie and TV experience? In movies, you're having a communal experience with other people in the audience. It may only be 10 people or maybe 500, I don't know. But you're having a communal experience. How your fellow audience members react to the movie affects the way you react to the movie, whether you want it to or not. This is especially true in comedies, by the way. Audiences often laugh at things in a theater. You've probably had this experience of finding something hilarious in the theater, and then a little while later you go to show it to one of your friends or family members on a television screen or a computer screen. Look how funny this is, and they just stare at it like, what? It's clearly you had to be there. When you're laughing or having any kind of experience with with an audience, a theater full of people, it's a bonding experience between you and your fellow humans that doesn't exist when you're watching television alone, or really even if you're sitting there with one or two other people. It's not the same. That, by the way, that also works in reverse. I remember my wife and I went to see The Big Lebowski when it first came out. We were both Coen Brothers fans, so we kind of had an idea what to expect, but most of the rest of the audience did not. And they just sat there while we were laughing hysterically throughout the film. So that does happen sometimes too. But mostly you tend to pick up the cues from the rest of the audience. And I suspect because a certain number of the people in the audience just didn't get the Coen Brothers' sense of humor, other people who might have enjoyed the experience otherwise also didn't laugh. They picked up on their cues from their fellow audience members. What else? In movies, the audience has no control. You can't stop the movie, you can't pause it, you can't rewind it, you can't adjust the volume, can't change the channels. When you go into a movie theater, it's a different experience. You willingly give yourself to the storyteller, hoping to be swept away. And when you are, it's pure joy. But when you're not, it's a major disappointment. It's a lot like sex in that regard. Whereas in television, oh, that didn't work, you just change the channel. You don't feel that betrayed by the storyteller, as you do when you go to a movie. So how does all this affect the way you write? Well, in TV, let's start here. The primary landscape in television is the human face. Like these. So as a result, you're going to tend to tell more intimate stories, smaller stories, personal stories in television. Likewise, spectacle doesn't really work very well in television. So look at this clip from Close Encounters of the Third Kind that blew the audience out of their theater seats in 1977. That same scene on television is okay. It's fine. It's a good scene. It's well directed, but it doesn't blow you away. Likewise, the Stargate sequence in the third act of 2001 really doesn't work very well on television at all. In the movie theater, trust me, in 1967 or 8, I guess, in the movie theater, it knocked you out of your seats. So when you're writing for television, you're going to be writing more about character movement than you are physical movement. In other words, to keep the audience engaged and keep them from changing channels, yeah, you need to be fast-paced, but the pacing has more to do with character movement than physical action. And also, and this is a big deal, a TV series doesn't end definitively with an absolute conclusion. Episodes rarely end with a bomb going off, like in the end of a James Bond movie, or with someone getting killed or a divorce. Consider Streetcar Named Desire, the play, and then later the movie. Okay, the situation is this. Stanley Kowalski, married, his wife is named Stella. They live in a seedy apartment in New Orleans. Her sister, Blanche Dubois, comes to stay with them. She's a faded Southern belle whose last chance at trying to snag a man is coming up, better come up pretty fast, because otherwise, she's stuck in this apartment with these two people who don't really want her there. By the end of the play and the movie, Stanley, who is a brute and a crude guy and feels like Blanche looks down on him, rapes Blanche Dubois. She goes into basically a catatonic state, and when Stella comes home and she tells her what happened, Stella refuses to believe it, even though in her heart she knows it's probably true. Blanche winds up being carted away to a mental institution. The end. Okay, one of the most powerful dramatic endings to a story in the recent years. But you can't do that in television. That's not an episode of television. However, if I brought Stella home early, just before Stanley attacks Blanche Dubois, and everybody freezes in place, and Stella senses the sexual energy in the room and the incipient violence in the room, and Stanley knows that his wife senses it, and Blanche knows that Stella knows, and the three of them are frozen in place, and then I went to black, that would be the end of a pilot. I would tune in next week to see how this thing resolves, because I've got three people in a very tense, dangerous situation, and I want to see what happens next week. It's a smaller resolution. You can't definitively end things the way you do in movies or in plays. But that is often a good thing, because think about it. Most of us, our lives are not composed of gigantic, dramatic incidents every day or two. A big dramatic change in our life happens maybe every year or two or 5. And so those small incremental resolutions that tend to happen in television are actually in many ways often closer to the truth of the human experience. We end an episode of Everybody Loves Raymond ends with Raymond still under his mother's thumb. An episode of Seinfeld ends with Seinfeld still susceptible to Kramer or George's latest schemes. They may have moved incrementally. Those characters may have moved incrementally, but they're still fundamentally the same, which is pretty close to real life. However, having said all that, all TV series episodes should have an emotional catharsis at the end. Catharsis meaning the release of a strong and powerful emotion. Catharsis comes from the Greek katharon, which means to cleanse. And if we, the audience, don't get a catharsis after having watched a story, we get really mad, because we are being asked to leave the theater, or if it's a television show, turn off the TV, in a state of tension and unease and dissatisfaction. So even a serialized episode should have a sense of some catharsis. Not the entire arc of the season, of course, but some mini catharsis within the larger catharsis. If you fail to do this, if you fail to provide the audience with a catharsis, they get very angry. And some examples are, there was a series a few years ago called The Following. It was an early kind of limited series. And they were trying to do Silence of the Lambs on TV, which is a fine thing to try to do. And they did it very well. The first season was very effective, very compelling. But then they didn't catch the serial killer, or maybe they caught him, but then he escaped again. So we just realized, well, this is just going to happen over and over and over. There's no real catharsis the way there was in Silence of the Lambs. And therefore, the audience lost interest, and it petered out after, I think, maybe 3 seasons. There was a show called Prison Break, which had the same problem. Once the season 1 ended with a prison break, well, then what are we doing for season 2? It just kept going and going and going, and audience lost interest in it eventually. Orphan Black was a recent series that suffered from the same problem. The episodes were very well done by and large, and it was very imaginative, but it just had no catharsis. You could see it was never going to end. So if it's never going to end, the audience just stop watching. Catharsis in television can be, and usually is, much smaller, as we discussed, than it would be in a feature film. For example, in a sitcom, often when I was writing sitcoms, the cathartic ending was often just the recognition by a character, or maybe even just by the audience, of some simple human truth. Oftentimes, it can just be some quirk of human nature that's exposed for us to see and enjoy. Here's an example of a classic one. It won an Emmy back in the 70s, an episode of The Mary Tyler Moore Show. And the situation is the characters all work at a local TV station, and the guy who's the clown on the local kiddie show dies in a kind of a comic way. And everybody at the station is sort of snickering behind their backs, except for the main character played by Mary Tyler Moore, who's adamant that they not laugh at this guy's death because it's not funny. He's a human being and it's not right to laugh at him. And then they all go to the funeral and the last scene, and this happens.
Chuckles the Clown brought pleasure to millions. The characters he created will be remembered by children and adults alike. Peter Peanut, Mr. Fee-Fi-Fo, Billy Banana, and my particular favorite, Aunt Yoo-Hoo. And not just for the laughter that they provided. There was always some deeper meaning to whatever Chuckles did. Do you remember Mr. Fee-Fi-Fo's little catchphrase? You remember how, when his arch rival, Senor Kaboom, hit him with a giant cucumber and knocked him down? Mr. Fee-Fi-Fo would always pick himself up, dust himself off, and say, "I hurt my poo-poo." Life's a lot like that. From time to time, we all fall down and hurt our poo-poo. If only we could deal with it as simply and bravely and honestly as Mr. Fee-Fi-Fo. And what did Chuckles ask in return? Not much. In his own words, a little song, a little seltzer down your throat. Excuse me, young lady. Yes, you. Would you stand up, please? Please, won't you? You feel like laughing, don't you? Don't try to hold it back. Go ahead, laugh out loud. Don't you see, nothing would have made Chuckles happier. He lived to make people laugh. Tears were offensive to him, deeply offensive. He hated to see people cry. So go ahead, my dear. Laugh for Chuckles.
Okay, now what are the types of television, fictional television, you might choose to write, if that's where the direction you want to go in? What are the types? Well, let's start here. Let's make a list. First of all, there's the multi-camera half-hour comedy. An example of that would be Friends.
Janice? You called Janice?
Yes, Janice. Why is that so difficult for you to comprehend?
You remember Janice, right?
Yes. She was smart, she was pretty, and she honestly cared about me. Janice is my last chance to have somebody.
Hello?
Oh my God.
Then there is the single camera half-hour comedy. An example of that would be Modern Family.
Life is full of change. Some big, some small. I learned a long time ago you can fight it, or you can try to make the best of it. And that's all a lot easier if you've got people who love you helping you face whatever life throws at you. At least that's what helps me sleep at night.
Now, here's an interesting fact. Half-hour comedies tend to rerun better than hour-long dramas, and nobody entirely knows why. I suspect it has something to do with the fact that you can watch a comedy over and over, even though you know all the jokes. You can discover nuances of performance or something about it that makes you want to watch it again and again. Whereas if you know the plot of a cop show, it's kind of, there is not much left to watch. But even that doesn't entirely explain it. And oddly enough, multi-camera comedies rerun better than single-camera comedies. I don't know why either, but my guess is that fourth wall in a multi-camera comedy, where the cameras are and therefore where the viewer is watching the show from, makes it feel like you're in the room, like you're in the apartment, like you're in the coffee shop with the characters. And that sort of cozy feeling feels good to people when they're, sitting home alone or cooking or whatever, and they want to put on something that's sort of a comforting show. Multi-camera and single-camera half-hour comedies make a lot of more money for the producers than hour-longs, as I said. But right now, multi-cameras are sort of out. There are some that still exist, but not many. They're thought by the powers that be to be sort of kitschy and cheesy, I guess, but also because they're very hard to execute. And by this point, we've lost an entire generation of potential half-hour comedy writer-producers who would know how to do it. It's very hard to do well. My generation is really the last ones who did it consistently, so it would be very difficult to start one up now since no one is trained how to do it. Nonetheless, it's a form that will almost certainly come back at some point because they rerun well. When they're successful, they're very successful, and they're relatively inexpensive to produce. What else? There are half-hour dramas, not many, but there are half-hour dramas. An example would be The Bear. Another one was recently The Patient. There are some hour-long comedies. An example would be Only Murders in the Building. Early in my career, I did have the weird experience of writing for an hour-long multi-camera comedy. It was called Husbands, Wives, and Lovers. It was maybe the only one-hour multi-camera comedy ever attempted. And there was a reason, because it didn't work. My experience is if you're going to do an hour-long comedy, you need something besides the comedy, like a mystery and Only Murders in the Building, something else to help sustain the audience's interest besides just the comedy. For more than half an hour, it just sort of seems like half an hour is a natural end point to a comedy, unless there's something else going on. And then what else? There's, of course, one-hour dramas, and there's a lot of them. Here's a few of them. There's a reason why crime shows, medical shows, and legal shows made up most of the hour-long dramas for a long period of time in television. And that's because they were always, in those formats, there were always characters who could come into the detective's office or into the doctor's office or into the lawyer's office and get a story and start a story. They have a problem that kicks off a story. So it was a natural place to put hour-long shows. What else is there? There are TV movies. Now, broadcast television networks used to make a lot of TV movies. Now they hardly make any, if any, at all. But they do exist, but they're on different platforms. They exist on streaming and premium platforms primarily. Netflix, Amazon, Apple, HBO/Max, Showtime, and probably some others, Stars, I guess, all do what are essentially TV movies. That is to say, they're movies that you watch on television. But there are other places as well. Hallmark, of course, makes an enormous number of TV movies. They are of a very specific criteria in terms of subject matter. They are very soft. Not anything you would see anywhere else, probably. They have very specific criteria in terms of the number of acts and how they break up their stories and so on. It's very specific. I would never write a screenplay on spec intending to give it specifically to Hallmark, because if Hallmark doesn't like it or you can't get it to them anyway, then you can't show it to anybody else. Nobody else would possibly be interested in anything that's soft. However, you can certainly, if you like material that's like romantic comedies that aren't particularly edgy, or even if they are kind of edgy, you could go ahead and write it, and Hallmark might be a place you could take it. I have a student friend who wrote a romantic comedy that was not intended at all to be a Hallmark movie, somehow got it to Hallmark. They read it and bought it and shot it. They made her go back and soften a lot of the jokes, of course, but it was a sale. It was a movie. Good for her. They don't pay a fortune, Hallmark, but they pay. And if you can get in the club among the people who regularly write for them, you can do okay at Hallmark. I never got in the club. Likewise, Lifetime makes a lot of TV movies. Sci-Fi Channel does TV movies. Shudder does TV movies. They usually are buying things that are already been made, but they may or may not be putting money into them. But nonetheless, they air them. And if they can be done cheaply enough, people can make money on them. But they are very, very cheap, it should be noted. Even cheaper than Lifetime. Even cheaper than Hallmark, rather. Very cheap. Often not, most of the time, not WGA, not DGA, often not even SAG. They're often shot in Canada or somewhere else where they can get because they can shoot it cheaper there, and often the quality or lack of quality in the acting performances is pretty obvious. Nonetheless, again, it's work. They do pay something. They're TV movies. What else is there? There's sketch comedy shows. Obviously like SNL, Saturday Night Live. SNL is currently, at this moment, one of the few sketch shows, but there are periodically more. Often they come up on Comedy Central. Key and Peele for years had a sketch show, and Amy Schumer. And I know that the comedian Shane Gillis has a sketch show. I think it's still in production. He airs on YouTube and makes a lot of money that way. Of course, he's a bit of a name, so it's different from just, anybody sticking a sketch on YouTube. May not make money at it, but it is a way to go. Live audience sketch shows like Saturday Night Live are very much like a multi-camera sitcom, by the way. That is to say, they're played to a live audience using a fourth wall like a play. And writing a sketch is very much like writing a scene from a sitcom as compared to filmed sketch shows like Amy Schumer or Key and Peele. Sketch comedy shows tend to have a somewhat limited shelf life because they're so dependent on immediacy, the immediacy of the experience, and the topicality of the material, that tends to change quite quickly with time. So I guess they're showing Saturday Night Live reruns somewhere, but I don't think too many people are interested in watching SNL sketches from 1989. But nonetheless, they're inexpensive to make generally, and if they catch on, can do quite well. What else is there? There are limited series, which used to be called mini-series, but now they're called limited series. Like these. Now, limited series can be anywhere from roughly 6 episodes to 12. I guess I've seen some shorter, possibly some longer. I would say the average is probably more like 8 or 10 in a season. But to my knowledge, there are very few rules on the number of episodes. Oftentimes they're structured like a feature screenplay. That is to say, the first episode of the limited series sort of takes you up to the inciting incident, which would be roughly page 15 in a traditional feature screenplay, and then the end of Act 1, which would normally be about page 30, is somewhere usually around the end of the second episode of the limited series, and so on. But often you will notice that limited series tend to stall midway through their run, as we sense the story spine is getting lost. It's vanishing because they're trying to pad out the season. They're trying to get to their 8 episodes or 10 or whatever it is. So they're wandering around just looking for anything like a conflict, and they lose the story spine and the drive of the story. Even good limited series often suffer from a sluggish pace, especially in the middle. The last episode is sort of often feels like the third act of the screenplay, but it's those middle episodes that get awfully sloppy. You have to find a way, if you're doing a limited series, to make each episode a satisfying story within itself, within the larger framework of the serialized story. And that's a challenge. It's hard to do, but it should be factored in when you sit down to structure a limited series. I just recently, with a director friend, wrote a pilot for a limited series along with the season, each episode plotted out, not written in script form. The pilot was written in script form, but each episode was plotted out, and we plotted it like a mystery story so that each episode had a suspect, in essence, and that suspect had a completed arc at the end of each episode within the larger framework of the larger mystery. But you have to find some way to do that, or you run the risk of that sloppy middle section just getting bogged down and the momentum of the story dying on you. The other way to do it, of course, is with a limited series, is to make the limited series an anthology, which are not many, but there are some. Black Mirror is an obvious example. Now, what else is there? There's animation. There's a lot of animation writing out there. And within that broad concept of animation, there are many different types of shows based mostly on the demographic age range you're aiming for. So, for example, there's adults. Most of these you'll notice are probably were on Cartoon Network, the Adult Swim portion of it, or Fox, FX, Comedy Central. Most adult animation is 2D, not 3D. I'm not quite sure what that is. 2D tends to play better for broad comedy, and most of these adult shows are fairly broad comedies. You should notice that, occasionally there are huge breakouts like South Park or The Simpsons, and they make a fortune. But most of these shows that you may very well love don't make nearly as much money as you probably think they do, and they don't make nearly as much money as kids' shows do. And the reason is because you can have a reasonably successful cartoon show even on a network, but what are you selling besides the show? You're going to sell some T-shirts maybe and coffee mugs, whereas a kids show is selling toys and games and all kinds of merchandise. So they love, the people with the money love making kids shows much more than adult shows. Adults like making adult shows. Writers like making adult shows. But the people with the money like making kids shows because they can have the potential to make a fortune. I cannot tell you how much money, how many billions of dollars Paw Patrol has made, among many other shows of its ilk. So there's adult. You can aim for them. Or you can aim for tweens, which is roughly, let's say, 8 to 15 in age range. Again, most of these are going to be 2D, not 3D. Then what else? There are bridge shows, and bridge means roughly 6 to 10 in terms of age. Now you'll notice those shows are ones that have material in it that is a little bit smarter than an average 8-year-old can probably get. A lot of the jokes are going to go over an 8-year-old's head, but at the same time the material is not so sexual or violent or terrifying that it's going to offend the parents of an 8-year-old. So it's acceptable for them, and they can eventually grow into some of the more sophisticated jokes and story turns. And bridge shows, again, are mostly 2D, not entirely. Some are 3D, but most of them tend to be 2D as well. And of course, then there's finally preschool animation. Fancy Nancy, which I wrote for, by the way, was considered a preschool show. It was on Disney Junior, so it was technically preschool, but it was really more of a bridge show. So those definitions, they're not rigid. A show like Tumbleleaf is very, very, very soft. But a show like Fancy Nancy had fairly sophisticated stories and some fairly sophisticated dialogue that most preschoolers would not understand. So there's a lot of room for maneuvering within those rough genres of animation. Preschool shows are almost all 3D, CGI 3D. I don't know why that is. I guess they've done research that says little kids like the look of 3D more than 2D. I don't know. So how does a TV script differ in terms of format, for example, from a standard screenplay? Mostly, they're pretty much the same as a screenplay, except for multi-camera sitcoms and live studio-based sketch comedy shows. Both of those are more like playwriting, and so their scripts are going to look a little different. I defined the difference between playwriting and screenwriting earlier in the series, but I'm going to do it again because it's important. In the broadest of strokes, this is it. In playwriting, you're trying to motivate the characters on stage to start talking. In screenwriting, you're trying to motivate the characters to shut up and get going. In playwriting, therefore, multi-camera sitcom writing, you have to motivate entrances and exits. You are limited in terms of how many, you're not going to cut away very much, if at all, out of a scene. You're going to stay on that scene most of the time and let it play out. Multi-camera sitcoms, like plays, are performance-based. They're not camera-based. Nobody's turning on an episode of Frasier to watch the dazzling camera work. They're turning it on, or any other multi-camera sitcom, whatever it might be, Friends, Big Bang Theory, to watch their actors they love performing the characters that they love. So you're going to tend to keep the camera pretty much on the actors all the time. So Big Bang Theory is a form of multicam, which is a form of playwriting. So here's a clip from Big Bang Theory that shows that.
Well, now here's a peculiar email. The president of the university wants me to meet him at his office tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Why? Doesn't say. Must be an emergency. Everyone at the university knows I eat breakfast at 8 and move my bowels at 8:20.
Yes, how did we live before Twitter?
But on the other hand, Young Sheldon is a spin-off of Big Bang Theory, but they chose to make that as a single camera sitcom, so that's a form of screenwriting, and it looks like this.
What are you going to name him?
Fish.
Fish?
I'm not ready to get attached. Fish are kind of boring. I know, isn't it great? But you can't even pet them. Maybe we can.
Baby, what's wrong?
I tried to pet fish. I was so slimy.
So therefore, a multi-camera script is going to tend to look more like a play, like a playwright script. It's not exactly the same form as the standard playwriting, so don't use that. If you get Final Draft or any other major screenwriting program, it should have a multicam sitcom format in it. You want to use that, but mainly you want to try to get a copy of the script of a typical script and try to match that as much as possible, because that's your best bet. It tends to look more like a play, and here's an example of a multi-camera script page. Now, the reason why the dialogue is double-spaced in multi-camera sitcoms is, again, it's a form of playwriting. So you do multiple rehearsals and multiple rewrites during the course of the production week. A typical sitcom, you read it on Monday morning, then from that point until you finally shoot it Friday night, it's constantly being rehearsed, rewritten, rehearsed, rewritten, just like a play is when it's being prepared for opening night on Broadway. It's a constant process of rewriting and revising. So the actors and the director and the other crew people need space within those dialogue chunks to put in little notes to themselves. So if it's an actor, they might be writing, at this point in the speech, that's where I'm going to raise my hand with this prop. They might make a note in the dialogue for themselves, or the director might make a note, or a camera person might make a note. Oh, when he says this word in the middle of this speech, I need to move to my next setup. So it's much more like a play, and therefore people need that extra space to write all those notes in. That's why they came to be written in double-spaced form. All other TV genres that we've discussed are a form of screenwriting, and most of the same rules of screenwriting formatting apply here as well. Here's an example of a typical sitcom, of a typical single camera show. Now, individual shows, of course, are going to vary. But as long as you're matching that standard of a screenplay, you're probably going to be in good shape, unless you're doing multi-camera or unless you're doing a live sketch, audience-based sketch show. Other than that, screenwriting is pretty much the same look. Coming up next, we're going to talk about writing pilots, because that's what people have to do now if they want to be TV writers. How to write a pilot. Coming up next.